She was cast out with 4 children in the dead of winter, humiliated in front of a town that chose silence. He was a quiet single father who never looked for a miracle, until one knocked on his door wearing threadbare boots and carrying everything she had left in the world. If stories of quiet courage, second chances, and the healing power of kindness move you, consider subscribing. You won't want to miss what happens next. Now let me take you to the snowy day that changed everything. The snow fell heavier than usual that morning in Pine Hollow, a quiet Colorado mountain town where people spoke softly and stared longer than they should. But today, even whispers had frozen in the air. The church bells had stopped tolling only minutes before, and yet the crowd still lingered in the courtyard, like the grief hadn't decided how to leave. Evie Langford stood stiff in the center of it all, her black coat far too thin for January. One arm cradled her youngest, barely 3 years old, while the other held the hands of her older children, ages 10, 8, and 6, trembling not from cold, but from confusion. They had just buried Mark Langford, Evie's husband, a troubled man gone far too soon, and not soon enough, depending on which member of his family you asked. "You should have left years ago," hissed Dolores Langford. Mark's mother, her gloved finger pointed at Evie like a weapon. Her voice rang louder than the wind. "You poisoned our boy. Now he's in the ground and we're left with this." She motioned toward the 4 children. The crowd shifted. No one stepped forward. Some turned away. A woman dabbed her eyes, but whether from sadness or shame, no one could say. "I don't want to hear another word," Dolores barked. "You're not family anymore, Evie. Take your bastards and go. You're not welcome here, not at the house, not in town, not even in memory." The words struck like a whip. Evie didn't cry, not in front of her kids. She held them tighter. The littlest one whimpered, burying his face in her collar. But Grandma, the 6-year-old girl, whispered, stepping forward. Dolores's voice cracked like glass. "Don't call me that." That was the moment it happened, the moment the town watched compassion die and said nothing. Evie looked around. No one met her gaze. "Mom," her oldest son said quietly, "why does everyone hate us?" Evie swallowed hard. The truth ached behind her teeth. She couldn't answer, not without falling apart. Then, from across the parking lot, a deep rumble interrupted the hush. A beat-up Ford pickup, rusty and missing a mirror, pulled up just past the church steps. Snow swirled around the tires as it came to a stop. The engine cut and the door creaked open. A tall, rugged man stepped out. His coat was patched, his jeans stained, and his long hair tucked under a worn knit beanie. Most didn't recognize him, or had chosen to forget him. Miles Rourke, the single dad who lived past the tree line, where no one ventured unless they were lost or desperate. He didn't walk fast, but he walked straight through the crowd, past the whispers, and stopped beside Evie. He looked once at the children huddled beside her, then met Dolores's eyes. "You done?" he asked, voice low but clear. Dolores recoiled slightly, not from fear, but from being seen. "This doesn't concern you," she snapped. Miles didn't move. "Looks to me like you're throwing 4 kids into a snowbank after a funeral. That concerns everyone." "Don't you judge me, I'm not," he said, just noticing no one else is stepping up. Dolores's husband Charles stepped forward, face flushed with cold and something else. "This is our family business. You don't get to interfere." Miles turned to him, eyes calm but unblinking. "Funny thing. Family's supposed to protect its own, but I see a mother clinging to her kids while the rest of you act like they're stray dogs." Gasps stirred the crowd. Some shifted uncomfortably. A man near the church doors coughed, but didn't speak. "I know what it's like," Miles continued, softer now. "To be looked at like you don't belong. To be talked about behind closed doors. To raise a child alone with more silence than help." Evie blinked at him. She hadn't spoken yet, not a single word. Her lips were blue from cold. Miles stepped closer. "You have somewhere to go." She shook her head barely. He peeled off his outer coat, heavy wool-lined, and wrapped it around her shoulders. "Then you're coming with me," he said, simply. "Don't be ridiculous," Dolores spat. "You can't just take them." Miles raised a brow. "You just told them to leave. Or is your cruelty only for show?" The final blow wasn't shouted. It didn't need to be. It was truth, and it landed like a stone. Dolores's breath caught. For the first time in years, she looked at the children not as burdens, but as something else. Her lip trembled. She turned away. Charles placed a hand on her shoulder, but she shrugged it off and walked toward their black SUV. Doors slammed. Silence followed. Miles turned to the kids. "I've got one room. It's not much, but it's warm. You'll be safe." They nodded one by one, as if they already knew. Evie looked at him then. Really looked. Not as a stranger, but as someone who hadn't just offered her shelter. He'd given her back her dignity. "Thank you," she whispered. Miles didn't smile. He just nodded. "Let's get out of the cold." As they walked toward the truck, Evie's 6-year-old slipped her hand into Eli's, Miles's quiet, wide-eyed son, waiting in the back seat. And that was the first miracle. Not the rescue, not the warmth, but the beginning of a family that had no reason to exist, except for kindness. The snow fell in silence, now muffling the old Ford pickup as it crawled its way along the mountain road. Inside the cab, no one spoke. Evie sat stiff in the passenger seat, Miles's coat still draped around her shoulders. The children were huddled in the back seat, with Eli, Miles's son, who sat like a statue, eyes watching everything and nothing at once. They reached the edge of Pine Hollow's last plowed road and crossed into the trees. The truck bounced along a narrow path framed by firs weighed down by snow. The forest seemed to lean in around them as if curious to see what was happening. Evie glanced sideways at Miles. He gripped the wheel with one hand, the other resting loosely in his lap, eyes focused ahead. He didn't offer comfort. He didn't explain. And somehow, that made her trust him more. The house appeared suddenly tucked into the trees, like it had been forgotten. A small log cabin patched with sheet metal and mismatched wood, its chimney smoking faintly into the gray sky. The porch slanted slightly. A crooked railing leaned outward like a tired shoulder. Evie didn't flinch. She had seen worse. Miles cut the engine. "We're here." Evie opened the door, the cold biting her legs through her worn skirt. She lifted her youngest onto her hip, while the other children climbed out slowly, unsure their shoes, crunching into the deepening snow. Miles opened the back door and held out a hand to his son. Eli helped them inside. Eli nodded once, and without a word, led the children up the steps and through the front door. Inside it was warmer, but not by much. A fire glowed faintly in the stone hearth, casting a shaky light across a room that was small but clean. A patchwork rug lay worn across the wooden floor. The furniture looked handmade, functional, plain, solid. There were toys in one corner scattered neatly, and a book open on the couch with a pair of reading glasses balanced on top. Evie held her breath. The air smelled of pine ash and something faintly sweet like cinnamon and old leather. Miles stepped inside behind them and motioned to a side door. "There's one bedroom with bunks. You can have that. I'll take the cot in the pantry." Evie opened her mouth to protest but stopped. She hadn't expected any of this. "Thank you," she said softly. Miles nodded, pulled off his boots and disappeared into a back room. The children followed Evie into the bedroom. It was small, just enough space for 2 sets of bunk beds and a narrow dresser. The walls were lined with flannel blankets tacked up like insulation. A small window was fogged over, but the view beyond revealed nothing but snow and trees. Her oldest, Jamie, looked at her uncertainly. "Is this where we're staying?" "For now," she said, her voice steady. "It's safe. That's what matters." He nodded and helped the others with their coats and shoes. The little ones sat on the bottom bunks, clinging to each other. No one cried. They were past tears. Evie knelt down, brushing hair from her daughter's face. "We'll be okay." Her daughter looked back at her, serious beyond her years. "He didn't even know us." "No." Evie whispered he didn't. That night, they ate soup from mismatched bowls, potato and lentil seasoned with herbs Evie didn't recognize. Miles said nothing as they ate. Eli sat beside his father, methodically tearing a piece of bread into tiny cubes before eating them one by one. The silence was strange, not uncomfortable, just new. The kind where no one needed to fill space for the sake of it. After dinner, Evie offered to wash the dishes. Miles nodded and stepped outside into the snow, carrying an axe. Through the frost-covered window, she watched him split wood in the moonlight, steady and deliberate. Every movement was purposeful, not rushed, not angry, just steady. "He does that every night," she asked Eli, who was still sitting at the table. Eli looked up. His eyes were deep and unreadable. He nodded once, then turned to the fire and sat cross-legged in front of it. When Miles returned, his hands were red and raw. He stacked the wood by the hearth and added 2 fresh logs. The fire grew. The warmth finally began to creep through the room. Evie touched his sleeve lightly. "You didn't have to give us your room." He looked at her, expression unreadable. "I remember what it felt like to need help and not get it." She held his gaze for a second too long, then nodded. That night, as the children settled into their borrowed beds, Evie stayed up a little longer. She found a loose sheet of paper in the kitchen drawer and a pencil stub and began to sketch something, habit maybe. Shapes from memory, threads in her head. She hadn't drawn in months. In the other room, Miles lay awake on a cot, too short for him, staring at the ceiling beams. He could hear soft breathing through the walls. 5 new lives under his roof. 5 reasons to keep the fire going. Eli sat beside the fire, still drawing quietly in a corner of a coloring book. Every few minutes he glanced toward the hallway where the others slept. He didn't know their names yet, but he knew they weren't strangers anymore. It had snowed again overnight. Not much, but enough to muffle the world into something quieter, softer. Morning came slowly in the cabin, seeping in through the fogged windows like a shy guest unsure of its welcome. Evie woke before the children instinct, still wired from months of chaos. She lay on the bottom, bunk eyes open, listening to the rhythm of 5 different breaths. Hers was the only one not steady. Outside the door, she heard the soft crackle of firewood being added to the hearth. Miles was already up. She had no idea how long he had slept, if he'd slept at all. She slipped from the bed and tiptoed to the kitchen, careful not to wake the others. Miles stood near the stove, stirring something in a battered saucepan. The scent of cinnamon and oats filled the room. He glanced at her. "Morning." "Good morning," she replied, pulling his coat tighter around her. "You didn't have to make breakfast. I always do. Eli eats early." Evie glanced at the boy who sat at the table with his usual silence. He was sketching again, small, detailed lines across a folded piece of paper. She couldn't tell what it was, but she noticed the way his shoulders relaxed as he drew, like each stroke let some pressure escape from within. "Does he talk?" she asked gently. "Not often," Miles said. "But he listens." Evie nodded. She respected that kind of quiet, the kind not rooted in fear, but in deep observation. Eli had the eyes of someone who saw more than he ever said. Moments later, the children emerged from the hallway, yawning and rubbing their eyes. Her daughter Maddie, still in her mismatched flannel pajamas, was dragging a red ball of yarn behind her, like a pet on a leash. Evie smiled. "Where'd you find that?" "In a drawer under the sink," Maddie said, holding it up. "It's kinda tangled, but I like it." Evie recognized it instantly. It was hers, a leftover from a project she never finished. Maddie had always been drawn to color, especially red. Her little fingers were already looping the yarn between them, forming a loose chain. "Don't take too much of Mr. Miles's things," Evie said gently. "It's okay," Miles replied without looking up. "Yarn's meant to be used." Maddie beamed, then turned and walked toward the table, plopping down beside Eli. Without hesitation, she placed the ball of yarn on the table, then began wrapping it loosely around her fingers. Eli paused his drawing. Maddie leaned in. "Want me to make you a bracelet?" He didn't speak, but he didn't move away either. He watched her hands work the yarn slowly, methodically, the way her mother had taught her to finger chain on long nights when the heater didn't work and stories were all they had. Within a few minutes, she'd made a red loop tied off at the end. She slid it across the table toward him. Eli stared at it, then picked it up. He didn't put it on right away. He simply held it in his palm like he was weighing its meaning. "Red means safe," Maddie whispered, not looking at him. Eli blinked once, then quietly, carefully he slipped it over his wrist. Miles saw it from the stove. He didn't say anything, but he stirred the oatmeal a little slower. Later that morning after breakfast, the children bundled up in borrowed coats and ventured outside. Miles handed Evie an extra scarf and a pair of old boots. "They're not pretty, but they'll keep you dry." She smiled. "At this point, pretty's a luxury I gave up a long time ago." They stepped outside together, the snow crunching underfoot. The trees stood tall and silent, branches heavy with white. The children built a lopsided snowman by the tree line. Maddie kept darting between the house and the snow, checking on Eli, who remained on the porch steps. He sat with his sketch pad in his lap, red bracelet around his wrist, drawing something with more intensity than usual. Evie stood beside Miles, watching. "He's different with her," she said. "Yeah," Miles replied. She didn't ask anything of him. "That helps." Evie turned to him. "You're good with silence," he glanced at her. "I've had years of practice." There was no sadness in his voice, just fact. She looked down, fiddling with the edge of her borrowed scarf. "I used to talk too much, fill every gap with words just to keep the noise going." Mark hated that. Miles didn't react. "I stopped talking," she continued. "Not just to him, to everyone, even the kids. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe everything would stop falling apart." She didn't realize her voice was cracking until the last word. Miles didn't offer comfort. No cliches, no awkward reach for a tissue. Instead, he said something she didn't expect. Maybe falling apart was the start of something better. Evie blinked at him. "You believe that I have to," he said simply. That night, Maddie insisted on showing Eli how to finger chain yarn. She handed him another piece, this one purple, and demonstrated the looping motion again and again until his fingers mirrored hers, clumsily, like a beginner pianist learning the first scale. Eli didn't speak, but for the first time he laughed, a soft, startled sound, like someone remembering how to breathe underwater. Evie heard it from the kitchen and nearly dropped the spoon she was stirring. Miles glanced up too. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened just enough. Later, when the children had gone to bed and the cabin was quiet again, Evie walked into the living room and found a red yarn bracelet left neatly on the windowsill. Beside it was a small drawing. 7 stick figures, her, the children, Miles and Eli, all standing in a row. Over their heads was a single line drawn in red, tying them together. For most of his life, Eli Rourke had drawn the world without faces. People in his sketches had hats or hair scarves or shadows, but never eyes, never mouths. It wasn't that he couldn't draw them. It was that he didn't know where to begin. Faces were complicated. They moved. They judged. They disappeared. He drew trees instead, steady and quiet. Cabins, fences, firewood stacked just right. He liked drawing shoes. People didn't look at shoes. But that week, something shifted. The red yarn bracelet still sat wrapped around his wrist, fraying at the edges, where he picked at it unconsciously. He hadn't taken it off since Maddie gave it to him. And now, in the warmest corner of the cabin, Eli stared at his newest drawing. 7 figures standing in a line holding hands. But this time, the faces were there. Maddie's had freckles. Her grin was wide, missing a front tooth. Jamie's eyes were slanted in a permanent squint, half mischief, half caution. Their baby brother had curls and a thumb in his mouth. The youngest girl wore pigtails and her mother's frown. Evie's face had tired eyes and soft cheeks, like she'd just finished crying but didn't want anyone to know. And beside her, slightly apart from the others, was Miles. His face was the hardest to get right. It was quiet. Not blank, but held back, as if it had seen something and chosen not to speak of it. And Eli's own face. He drew it last, tiny tucked behind the rest as if unsure whether he belonged. He gave himself a small smile. It was the first time in 8 years he'd drawn himself with one. That morning, Evie found the drawing taped to the fridge. She froze mid-step, hand still holding a mug. The figures stared back at her in bright crayon strokes, each one unmistakable. Her breath caught when she saw her own face, not beautiful, not glamorous, but real. Honest. She ran her fingers over the paper like it was sacred. Miles walked in behind her. "He left it there for you." "For me?" she asked. "He only tapes them when he wants someone to see." Evie stared at the boy in the picture. "He's smiling." Miles nodded, pulling on his boots. "Yeah." She turned to him, eyes glistening. "Does he know what this means?" "I think he knows what it feels like." Outside, the children played in the snow-covered field behind the cabin. Jamie had crafted a sled from an old door and 2 pieces of scrap metal, and the kids took turns, pushing each other down the small hill that sloped into the trees. Eli sat on the steps again, drawing as he watched. But every few minutes he looked up and waved when Maddie called his name. He didn't join them, not yet, but the wave was new. And that was enough. Evie stood by the window, watching arms crossed, a faded quilt around her shoulders. "I used to think healing would be loud," she whispered, "like a celebration. But this is quieter," Miles said beside her. "But just as real." She nodded, then asked something unexpected. "Did Eli's mother draw?" Miles hesitated, then answered softly. "She painted. Watercolors. Mostly landscapes. She liked soft edges." "Where is she now?" "Gone. 6 years." Evie didn't ask more. She didn't need to. Some absences filled the room louder than words. Later that night, the cabin was still lit only by the soft orange glow of the fire. Evie sat at the kitchen table, a sketch pad open in front of her. The children were asleep. Miles was outside, stacking the last of the chopped wood. She traced lines on the page. Nothing finished, just curves and angles. Shapes of lives coming together in unexpected ways. Eli walked in silently and hovered by the table. She looked up and smiled. "Couldn't sleep." He shook his head. She gestured to the seat across from her. He sat, placing his sketch pad on the table. "I saw your picture," she said gently. He glanced at the fridge, then back down. It was beautiful. Eli hesitated, then opened his pad and turned it toward her. It was a new drawing, just one person this time. Her. She stared at it, stunned. It wasn't detailed, but it was her. The tired eyes, the cautious smile, the way her hands always seemed to be mid-motion, her hair pulled back with strands always falling out. And this time there were eyes. Tired? Yes. But bright. Still watching. She pressed her hand over her heart. "Thank you, sweetheart." Eli looked down. A blush crept across his cheeks. Evie reached over and gently touched the yarn bracelet still around his wrist. "This is the best gift anyone's given me." After a moment, Eli whispered, barely audible, "You're nice." Evie froze, then blinked hard. "I try to be." He nodded, then picked up his sketchpad and walked away. Evie stayed there long after the fire dimmed the drawing still in her hands, warmth blooming in places she'd forgotten she had. Evie had always believed her hands knew what her heart couldn't say. When words failed, when tears were too tired to fall, when life became too loud or too empty, she would sew. Back when the kids were babies, and Mark was in and out of jobs, and trouble, she would wait until the house was quiet, then sit by the cracked window with a needle and thread and patch what she could: socks, school bags, a ripped hem, a heart breaking in silence. She hadn't sewn in months, maybe years, but today that changed. It began with a cardboard box. Miles had dragged it in from the attic while searching for winter boots for Jamie. The box was unmarked, dusty, and heavier than it looked. Evie opened it cautiously. Inside were pieces of old clothing, Miles's, probably his wife's, maybe even his mother's. Worn-out shirts, baby blankets, a tattered flannel robe. Nothing matched. Nothing looked useful. But to Evie, it was a gold mine. She pulled out a piece of soft denim, rubbed it between her fingers, and exhaled slowly. For the first time in a long while, she wanted to create. "What are you thinking?" Miles asked later, watching her spread fabric on the kitchen table. "A quilt," she replied without looking up. "A real one. Not perfect, but warm." He leaned against the doorframe. "You make quilts I used to, back when things felt fixable. You think they're not." She looked up at him, then really looked, and smiled, soft and crooked. "No. I think I just needed reminding that some things still are." The children watched with fascination as Evie began cutting the fabric into uneven squares. Maddie offered the red yarn, but Evie shook her head. "We'll save that for something special." Instead, she used heavy thread and hand-stitched each piece, slowly, deliberately. It wasn't just fabric. It was story, memory, survival. A square from Eli's baby blanket, a strip of flannel from Miles's old work shirt, a corner of the coat that once belonged to Mark because even pain had a place in the patchwork. Every night after dinner, the cabin transformed into a quiet workshop. Jamie learned to hold the fabric taut. Maddie insisted on picking color pairings. Even the younger ones helped by sorting buttons by shape and color, placing them in a reused cookie tin with mismatched labels. Eli watched the process closely, his sketchbook in his lap. On the second night, he drew a version of the quilt with each square labeled by name: Mom's memory, Miles's old shirt, Maddie's red thread. Evie tucked the picture between the pages of her own notebook, the way someone might hide a treasure map. On the third night, Miles brought down a box from the loft, marked June. Inside was a folded, half-finished quilt, the thread still trailing from the last stitch. "My wife started this," he said, voice low. She always meant to finish it. Evie unfolded it gently. The fabric was lighter, more delicate sunflower prints and sky blues. Soft, feminine. She had a beautiful eye for color, Evie said. Miles nodded. She said quilts were like prayers. The more pieces, the more someone had to say. They didn't speak for a while, but something old and kind passed between them. Grief meeting gratitude in the middle of a pine-scented room. By the end of the week, Evie's quilt was finished. It wasn't perfect. The corners were crooked. The thread showed in places. But it was real, stitched from worn-out things made new again. She laid it across the couch like an offering. That night, as the fire crackled low and the children slept, Miles picked it up, unfolded it, and wrapped it around his shoulders. "Warm," he said. Evie smiled. "That's the idea." Then he said something that surprised them both. "You should sell them." She blinked. "What quilts? Handmade. People still care about things with stories. Things made slow." She shook her head. "I'm not ready." "You don't have to be ready. You just have to start." He didn't push. He just left the idea there like a seed. The next day, Maddie asked if they could name the quilt. Quilts should have names, she said matter-of-factly, braiding her doll's hair with a piece of leftover thread. Evie tilted her head. "What would you name it?" Maddie thought for a moment, then smiled. "Second chances." Evie's chest tightened. "Why that?" "Because it was old stuff before, but now it's something good." Eli nodded almost imperceptibly, as if that made perfect sense. That weekend, Jamie took a picture of the quilt and uploaded it to an old online marketplace account Evie hadn't touched in years. He added a caption she didn't write, but that made her cry anyway. "Made by my mom, who believes people and fabric both deserve a second chance." They didn't expect much. But on Monday morning, the first order came in from a teacher in Oregon. 2 more followed before noon. Evie stared at the screen fingers hovering over the keyboard, unsure if she should cry or laugh. Miles walked past, coffee in hand, and glanced over her shoulder. "Looks like you just started." That night, wrapped in the quilt named by her daughter and stitched by trembling hands, Evie sat by the fire and whispered a prayer she didn't know she still believed in. Not for success, not for more orders. Just this: thank you for the pieces I thought I'd lost, and the hands that helped me sew them back together. Outside, the wind howled gently through the trees, but inside the cabin, everything held. The storm arrived without warning. 1 hour the sky was silver and quiet. The next, clouds like bruises rolled in from the west, and the wind began howling through the trees with a voice that made even the birds fall silent. By late afternoon, the snow was coming sideways. Inside the cabin, the lights flickered, then went dark. "Power's out," Miles said calmly, checking the breaker box. "Grid's down." "Will it be back soon?" Evie asked, her voice low but steady. "Not tonight. Maybe not for a couple days. They've been behind since the last ice storm." Evie glanced at the kids. Maddie had gone still, her arms wrapping around the baby's shoulders like instinct. Jamie moved closer to the window, watching the trees bend under the wind. Evie exhaled. "We'll be okay." "We will," Miles said, "as long as we keep the fire going." He moved fast but quietly, loading wood into the hearth, pulling extra blankets from the loft, filling pots with water before the pipes froze. The generator had long since died and wasn't worth fixing. The cabin's warmth would depend entirely on fire patience and what was left in the pantry. Evie checked the shelves: beans, oats, a bag of potatoes, some rice. Not abundant, but enough. What they didn't have was medicine. That night, the baby Caleb developed a cough. It started shallow but deepened with each hour. Evie recognized the sound the way mothers do. Not panic, but danger. She wrapped him in a blanket and held him close, rocking gently by the fire while the other slept in a pile of quilts nearby. Miles sat across from her, sharpening a knife on a leather strap. "Sounds bad," he said. "I think it's bronchial. He's had it before. Needs the vapor rub and a warm compress. Maybe a cough suppressant if it gets worse. I've got Vicks and honey," Miles said. "But I don't have any cash for a trip into town." Evie's eyes met his. "Neither do I." He nodded once, stood, pulled on his coat. "Where are you going?" she asked. "Woodpile. We're low." She started to rise. "I can help. Stay. Keep him warm." And then, without fanfare, he stepped into the blizzard. Outside, the snow slapped him like open palms. The cold bit through every seam in his jacket. But Miles moved forward, pushing through drifts up to his knees, carrying only an old wheelbarrow and the axe he'd inherited from his father. By the time he reached the back of the property, his beard was frozen stiff. His breath came in clouds, but he kept going. He chopped, and chopped, and chopped. Each swing wasn't just for warmth. It was for them, the mother still up, cradling her sick child, the boy who no longer feared strangers, the girl who'd tied yarn around his son's wrist like a promise. For Eli, for every version of himself who had ever needed help and didn't get it. The blade struck wood again and again until his arms burned, until his hands bled through the gloves, until he couldn't feel anything but purpose. Inside, Evie watched the fire grow dim. She shifted Caleb in her arms and whispered stories into his ear, half real, half imagined, about fields full of golden thread and quilts that could sing lullabies, and a house made of wood that never splintered. When the wind howled louder, she sang softly. It was off-key and cracked with worry, but it kept the dark at bay. Sometime after midnight, the door groaned open, and Miles returned, dragging in enough wood to last 3 more days. His coat was soaked, his cheeks were raw, his hands trembled as he laid the logs by the fire. Evie stood. "You're frozen." "I'm fine." "No, you're not." She reached for his hands, pulling the gloves off gently. They were torn, blistered red. "You did this for us." Miles looked at her eyes, unreadable. Didn't feel like a choice. She guided him to a chair and wrapped a towel around his shoulders, then sat on the hearth and pressed ointment gently into his palms. Her fingers worked slowly, and for the first time in weeks, the space between them wasn't just safe, it was sacred. That morning the storm passed. The power didn't come back, but the sun did. Light spilled across the wooden floor in long golden lines. The cabin smelled of firewood, honey, and something healing. Caleb's cough had quieted. Eli had curled up at his feet, drawing in the margins of an old cookbook. Jamie was outside building a wall of snow bricks for fun. Maddie and her sister were braiding strands of leftover quilt fabric into doll dresses. Evie sat beside Miles at the table. His hands were wrapped but steady. She looked at him and said quietly, "When we get out of this, when we have enough, I want to pay you back." Miles met her gaze. "I'm not keeping score." "I know. But I am." He didn't argue, just nodded once and said something she never forgot. "Some debts aren't meant to be repaid, just passed on." Evie reached out, placed her hand over his on the table, not as a guest, not as a burden, but as someone who'd begun to understand home wasn't a place you earned. It was a place where someone kept the fire burning for you, even when it hurt. Evie never meant to share it. It had been a long day. The children were finally asleep, the fire just coals in the hearth, and Miles had gone outside to fix the hinges on the back door that the wind had battered loose during the storm. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that lets thoughts surface like ripples on a still lake. She sat with her tea cooling in her hands, the steam barely visible in the fading warmth of the cabin. A notebook lay open on the table beside her, the same one where she sketched ideas for new quilts, grocery lists, and scribbled bedtime stories for the children. But tonight, her pencil moved differently. She didn't plan the words. They just came like water pouring from a cracked dam. A letter written to no one in particular. Maybe to herself. Maybe to the version of her who stood in the snow 7 weeks ago, shaking in the silence of abandonment. She wrote, "You don't know him yet, but there's a man who will step between you and the worst version of the world. He won't promise anything. He won't fix everything. He'll just open a door, give you a coat, light a fire and keep it going. And you'll think it's nothing, but it will be everything." When she looked up, her tea was cold. Her hand ached. Without thinking, she tore the page from the notebook, folded it twice, and tucked it into an envelope she found in the drawer. It had no stamp, no address. She set it aside, intending to throw it away in the morning, but Jamie found it first. The next day, while organizing the supply shelves for a homeschool project, Jamie discovered the envelope. Thinking it was part of the shipping labels for the quilt orders, he placed it with the outgoing stack near the front door. Evie didn't notice it was gone until 2 days later, when the letter was already in the hands of a local librarian named Cheryl Riggins, who'd ordered a quilt for her sister. Cheryl read the note, twice, then posted it to a community blog titled Letters That Found Me. A day later, someone shared it on Facebook. By the end of the week, it had been reshared over 12,000 times. Evie didn't know any of this until her inbox exploded. It started with a message from a teacher in Vermont. "I read your letter. I cried at my desk. I showed it to my students. Thank you." Then came one from a widow in Idaho. "I thought no one would ever see me again. But you reminded me I still matter." By day 3, Evie was getting interview requests from local radio stations, podcasts, and even a regional morning show. She stared at her phone in disbelief, reading email after email from strangers who had seen a version of their own brokenness reflected in her words. When she finally told Miles, he was fixing the hinge on the cabinet door. "I didn't mean to send it," she said, voice barely above a whisper. He stood up slowly, wiped his hands on a rag. But maybe someone else needed to read it. She looked at him, eyes full of apology. "I never thought it would go so far." He studied her a long moment, then gave a small, lopsided smile. "It's a good thing, Evie." "I feel exposed," she admitted. "Maybe. Or maybe you've just been seen for the first time in a long while." Later that night, she found Maddie sitting in the hallway, holding her doll wrapped in the Second Chances quilt. "Mom," Maddie asked, "are we going to be famous now?" Evie laughed, kneeling down. "No, honey. We're just heard." "What does that mean?" Evie thought for a moment, then smoothed the doll's hair. "It means when you speak, someone listens. And when you're quiet, someone still cares." 2 days later, a large envelope arrived in the mail addressed simply to Evie the Quilt Lady. Inside was a handwritten letter from a woman named June Price, who ran a nonprofit initiative in Oregon that supported single parents through trauma recovery programs. "We read your letter out loud during our community dinner. There wasn't a dry eye. If you're ever willing, we'd love to feature your story and your quilts as part of our campaign this spring. The world needs more women like you who stitch beauty from brokenness." Evie folded the letter slowly, her hands trembling. Miles watched her from across the room, reading her expression like Braille. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded. "I think I might actually be." That evening, after the children had gone to bed, Evie stood by the fire, holding the red yarn bracelet Eli had given back to her that morning. He'd simply placed it on the table with a note. "You can give this to someone else who needs safe. It broke her, in the best way." She clutched the bracelet to her chest and whispered to the quiet room, "Thank you for turning what I thought was the end into someone else's beginning." Miles walked in then, and for the first time she met his gaze without fear, without apology. "I think I'm ready," she said. "For what?" "To tell our story." He raised an eyebrow. "Ours." Evie stepped closer. "Yours. Mine. The kids. Eli. The quilt. The firewood. The letter. All of it." He didn't say anything for a long time. Then he reached for her hand. "You're the bravest person I know." She shook her head, smiling through tears. "No. Just a woman who ran out of excuses not to hope." The knock came on a Tuesday morning just after the snow had melted into patches of stubborn ice, and the air had started to taste like early spring. Evie was in the kitchen, dusted with flour, helping Maddie roll out biscuit dough, while the baby napped and the others worked on their homeschool assignments at the table. Miles was chopping kindling behind the cabin sleeves, rolled up sweat steaming from his shoulders in the late morning sun. When the knock came, it was deliberate, not loud, but not shy either. Evie wiped her hands on a dish towel and opened the door. 2 people stood on the porch. The first she recognized immediately, Dolores Langford, her former mother-in-law wrapped in a camel-colored coat and clutching a leather purse like it was a shield. The second was a man in a black overcoat and wire-rimmed glasses, an attorney by the look of him. Evie's breath caught. "Mornin', Dolores," said tight-lipped. "We need to talk." Evie didn't respond. Her fingers curled around the edge of the door knuckles, whitening. "May we come in?" the attorney asked. Evie shook her head slowly. "No." "But you can say what you came to say." The man cleared his throat. "I'm Robert Keene, legal counsel for Mrs. Langford. We're here regarding custody." "Custody," Evie repeated, her voice hollow. "Yes. As next of kin to the children's deceased father, Mrs. Langford is filing a petition for full legal guardianship of all 4 minors." Evie blinked. It felt like the porch dropped out beneath her. Dolores spoke, then her voice cold and resolute. "We gave you a chance, Evie. But dragging those children out to a shack in the woods with a man you barely know, that's not parenting. That's reckless." Evie's throat burned. "You left us in the snow." Dolores didn't flinch. "You left Mark first." Before Evie could reply, the sound of footsteps approached. Miles. He didn't ask questions. He just stood beside her, towering over the lawyer, with his arms crossed and jaw tight. "Is there a court date?" he asked flatly. "Yes," Keene said. 3 weeks from today. Evie will be served official notice within the next 48 hours. They left without another word. Evie stood frozen, the wind blowing through the open door like a warning. Miles closed it gently, then turned to her. "I'm sorry," he said. "This is going to be a fight." Evie met his eyes. "Then we fight." The next few days passed in a haze of paperwork and calls to legal aid hotlines. Evie filled out forms, gathered documents, wrote statements, until her fingers cramped. She barely slept. Every time she looked at her children, a knot tightened in her chest. "How do you prove a home is a home?" she whispered one night, head in her hands at the kitchen table. Miles sat across from her, elbows on his knees. "You don't prove it. You show it." "How?" He leaned forward. "By letting the people who've seen it, really seen it, stand beside you." When the day of the hearing came, the county courthouse was gray and cold, the kind of building designed to make everyone feel smaller. Evie sat on the bench outside the courtroom, her hands shaking as she clutched her copy of the petition. Miles sat beside her, Eli between them, holding a sketchbook in his lap. Dolores arrived in pearls and posture, flanked by her lawyer, and a brother-in-law Evie hadn't seen since her wedding. The courtroom was half full, mostly empty rows, a quiet judge with glasses low on her nose, and the soft clatter of a stenographer's keys. Evie told her story. She spoke plainly without dramatics. She didn't cry. She didn't need to. Then Miles was called. He answered questions calmly, respectfully. When asked why he took them in, his answer was simple: because no one else did. Dolores's lawyer tried to press. "So this wasn't a romantic relationship at the time," Miles replied. "No, it was an act of basic human decency." And when the judge asked if that had changed, Miles glanced at Evie. A pause. Then, "Yes. But that's not what this is about. This is about 4 children who finally smile in the morning and sleep through the night." The judge looked over her glasses at him. "And you? What do you get out of this?" Miles didn't blink. Family. Then came a moment no one expected. The judge turned to Eli. "Young man, would you like to speak?" Evie's heart stopped. Eli looked up from his sketch pad and nodded. He walked to the front slowly, carefully, and handed the judge a folded sheet of paper. She opened it, looked, blinked once. It was a drawing. 7 figures again, Evie, Miles, the children, and himself. But this time they were standing in front of the cabin. There was a fire inside. A dog, not yet real, slept on the porch. Everyone had a face. Everyone had hands linked. Above the scene was a single word written in bright red crayon, home. The judge smiled. Then softly, "That's all I need." The petition was denied. Full custody was retained by Evie, with a note of confidence from the court in her ability to raise her children in a stable, nurturing, and deeply bonded environment. Dolores left without a word. Evie stood on the courthouse steps, holding the hands of 2 of her children. Miles stood beside her, Eli tucked in his arm. The wind blew soft. "I didn't expect that," Evie whispered. "I did," Miles said. Evie looked at him. How he looked out at the mountains. Because when people finally see love in its quietest form, they stop needing to be convinced. Spring came slowly to Pine Hollow, like someone knocking gently before entering. It didn't arrive in fanfare or bloom. It came in small ways, birds singing before sunrise, snow retreating in patches to reveal wet earth and the distinct smell of pine warmed by sunlight. At the cabin, it arrived in the creak of windows, finally opened the hum of bees drifting toward the porch, and the thud of boots left by the door instead of beside the fire. Evie noticed it first in her children. Jamie no longer asked if they were staying. Maddie had started humming again, half-forgotten tunes that she used to sing with her grandmother. Even the baby Caleb had found his laughter, again deep belly giggles that made the walls feel wider. And Eli, he no longer sat apart. He drew on the porch now in full view of the world sketchbook open on his knees, his feet bare, his red yarn bracelet still wrapped around one ankle like a quiet tether to something that mattered. One afternoon, while the children napped or played out back, Miles carried a bench he had built himself down to the edge of the yard and set it beneath the old sugar maple, now dotted with the first blush of green. The wood was smooth sanded and stained with care, and on the center slat he had carved a single word in soft, cursive stillness. Evie stood watching him from the porch, that for me she called a teasing lilt in her voice. He looked up, squinting into the light. It's for whoever needs to remember that not moving is still a kind of progress. She came down the steps, brushing sawdust from his shoulder as she passed, then sat on the bench and looked out over the clearing where sunlight spilled across the grass like honey. "It's beautiful," she whispered. He sat beside her. For a while, neither of them said anything. The silence between them was full, not empty, and it felt like a conversation better than any they could have spoken aloud. "You ever think you'd end up here?" she asked eventually. Miles shook his head. "I thought I'd be alone by now. Quiet. Out of the way. Just Eli and I in the trees." Evie traced the grain of the bench with her finger. And now, he looked at her. Now there are fingerprints on every surface of my life, and I've never felt more whole. She smiled, but it trembled at the edges. I keep waiting for it to fall apart, like it's too good, like we didn't earn it. Miles reached over and took her hand, calloused. Meeting, calloused. "It's not about earning," he said. "It's about receiving." Evie turned to face him, eyes soft with something unspoken. "Can I ask you something honest?" she said. "Always." "Are you afraid of starting over?" Miles didn't answer right away. He stared at the sky through the shifting leaves, then said quietly, "I used to be. But then you all showed up, and I realized starting over isn't going back to the beginning. It's building something new with everything you've learned." She looked down at their intertwined hands. "Then maybe I'm ready," she said. For what to build? That evening, Evie found Jamie sitting on the steps with an envelope in his hands. "Found this in the mailbox," he said, handing it to her. It was from a small regional magazine. Evie opened it, heart fluttering. Inside was a short letter and a printed page. They had published her story. The letter, the one she hadn't meant to send, had now been reprinted alongside a feature about her quilts and the journey that led to their creation. Her photo was there too, standing in front of the cabin, Caleb on her hip and Maddie at her feet, holding a fabric scrap like a flag. Evie sat down beside Jamie and read it twice. Then 3 times. Then folded it gently and held it to her chest. Maddie came running up from the field, her hands full of dandelions. "For you," she shouted, breathless. "They're weeds, but pretty." Evie laughed and kissed her forehead. "Then, they're perfect." That night, Miles brought out a bottle of apple cider and poured 2 mismatched glasses. "To spring," he said, raising his. Evie clinked hers softly against his. "To second chances." They drank, smiling. Later, after the children had gone to bed and the fire had faded to a low amber glow, Evie stepped out to the bench beneath the tree. She sat alone for a moment, listening to the wind. Then Miles joined her. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. Evie rested her head on his shoulder and whispered, "You think people like us, people who break and mend and break again. You think we get forever." Miles wrapped an arm around her. "I think we get now. And if we're lucky, now keeps showing up every morning." She closed her eyes and exhaled. The night was quiet. But in the stillness, the world pulsed with life. The annual spring gathering in Pine Hollow wasn't much, but it meant something. It meant tables, draped with gingham cloths, homemade pie contests judged by old-timers, a hay bale maze for kids, and a makeshift stage in front of the library where anyone could play a song, recite a poem, or just stand and say thanks. This year, for the first time, Evie's family was invited as guests, not as a footnote to a tragedy or a whisper from the edges. They were asked to bring quilts, the ones with names the mayor had said, smiling. So they did. Evie laid out Second Chance's warm hands and thread between days on a wooden table under a banner that read, "Stories in Stitching." Maddie sold bookmarks made from leftover quilt scraps. Jamie demonstrated how to finger chain yarn. Even the baby Caleb toddled around with a basket full of lavender sachets that made older women coo and reach for their purses. It felt like life, but nothing prepared Evie for what happened near the end of the day. She was folding a tablecloth when she heard the first notes of a banjo. Not just any banjo. That banjo. Miles's banjo. She turned toward the stage, startled. And there he was, Miles, standing under the bare string lights, holding the old wooden instrument like it was a part of his body. He hadn't played in public since before Eli was born. Maybe not even since his wife died. Music had been something he buried with her, or so she thought. He strummed once more, then looked out into the crowd. "I'm not much for words," he said, into the mic, voice steady. "But lately someone's been teaching me how to show up anyway." Evie couldn't breathe. He didn't say her name. He didn't have to. Then he began to play. The melody was simple but full. It wasn't a love song. Not exactly. It was something older than love. Something like belonging. It sounded like firewood splitting, like wind through pine trees, like a second cup of coffee shared in silence. Eli stood off stage, holding a small box in his hands. His eyes were wide but proud. When the song ended, the crowd clapped politely, then warmly, then all at once, like something sacred had just happened. Evie's hands trembled. She hadn't realized she was crying until Maddie tugged on her dress and whispered, "Mom, look." Eli was walking toward her now, holding out the small wooden box. It was handmade, sanded smooth. On the top was a single carved word, us. Evie took it breath shaky, opened the lid. Inside was a square of red yarn, her first bracelet preserved like a relic. Beside it, folded neatly, was a new quilt square stitched from 2 different fabrics, one from her old coat, the other from Miles's work shirt. And underneath it all, a note in Eli's handwriting. You made us warm. Dad made us safe. Now we're not pieces anymore. Evie sat down on the edge of the stage, clutching the box to her chest. She didn't care that people saw. She didn't care that her mascara was running. She only knew that home wasn't something she walked into anymore. It was something that had grown around her like trees bending to shield a fire that refused to go out. That night, after the kids had fallen asleep, Evie and Miles stood together in the kitchen. The banjo leaned in the corner, silent again. I didn't know you'd do that, she said. Neither did I. Evie held the box in her hands. Why now? Miles looked at her, his eyes quieter than his voice. Because I thought I was just surviving, he said, until I realized I wasn't alone anymore. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small folded piece of paper. I was going to wait, he said, but I don't want to anymore. She unfolded it. It wasn't a poem, not a speech. Just one sentence: I'd like to keep building life with you, one stitch at a time. Evie looked up. I don't have a ring, he said quickly. I don't have a plan. I just have this. Us. And I know it's messy and late and unusual, but she stopped him with a kiss. Soft, certain, not rushed. When she pulled back, her eyes were shining. I don't need a ring. Or a plan. I just need the man who stood in a snowstorm and kept the fire going. Later, when they crawled into bed, Evie placed the box with the red yarn on the nightstand. Outside, spring whispered through the branches. And for the first time in a long, long while, neither of them dreamed of the past. They dreamed forward. By late May, the cabin had changed. It hadn't grown any bigger. The roof still sagged a little on the north side. The pantry door still stuck in humid weather. And the porch creaked every third step. But something was different. The garden out back had come to life, half wild, half tended, with Maddie's marigolds blooming beside Miles's onions, and Caleb's tiny footprints always showing up where no one expected them. A hammock now hung between 2 pines. There were wind chimes made of spoons and buttons, and a handmade sign nailed gently above the front door. This house wasn't built with walls. It was built with people who stayed. Evie read those words every morning, sometimes with coffee, sometimes barefoot on the porch, sometimes with a child curled against her hip, but always with that quiet, amazed disbelief that this was her life now. It had been nearly 4 months since the day in the snow. 4 months since she'd been cast out, seen as unworthy, unwanted. 4 months since Miles had looked at her and her children and said without speaking, I choose you anyway. And somehow in choosing each other, they had all come home. The quilts were selling faster than ever now, not because they were perfect, but because they weren't. People sent letters, strangers, friends of strangers, folks from towns Evie had never heard of. They wrote things like, this blanket feels like my grandmother's laugh, or I gave this to my daughter when her marriage ended. She said it helped her breathe again. Each note felt like a stitch sewn into something greater than fabric. One afternoon, Jamie asked if they could start teaching other kids how to quilt. Kids like we were, he added. Evie's heart swelled. You still are kids, Jamie grinned. Yeah, but we're different now. She nodded. Yes, you are. That same week, Miles received a letter of his own. It was from the school district. They had read about his involvement in Evie's family and the work he'd been doing for local food pantries. They wanted to offer him a part-time position, leading a woodcraft program for at-risk youth. He stared at the letter for a long time. "I haven't taught anyone anything in 10 years, he told Evie. She reached across the table, touched his hand. "You've been teaching us every day." He took the job, not because he wanted recognition, but because he finally believed he had something to give. On the first day of June, the family hosted a small picnic behind the cabin. There were only 12 guests, neighbors, 2 homeschool moms, a young couple who'd bought a quilt for their foster daughter, and Cheryl, the librarian, who had unknowingly published Evie's letter months ago. They brought folding chairs and lemonade. No one wore shoes. The kids ran through sprinklers and painted rocks. Music played from a cracked speaker, and at some point Miles picked up the banjo again, and no one asked him to stop. As the sun dipped low, Cheryl pulled Evie aside and said, "I've read a lot of stories in my life, but this one, yours. It's the only one that made me believe safe is something we build, not something we find." Evie smiled, eyes glistening. "Thank you," she said. "But I didn't build it alone." Later, as twilight settled in, and the children lay tangled in quilts on the grass, Evie and Miles sat on the porch, swing shoulder to shoulder, silence between them like a slow hymn. "You ever think we'd end up here?" she asked softly. "No," he said. "But now I can't imagine being anywhere else." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "What do you think made it work?" He paused, then answered. "We didn't try to fix each other. We just stayed, long enough for the broken pieces to feel safe again." Evie closed her eyes. "That's what home is, isn't it?" she whispered. "Not the roof, not the walls, just the staying." Miles nodded, and the listening, the choosing, over and over again. As the stars came out one by one, Eli padded out onto the porch, barefoot, his red yarn bracelet now faded to the color of old clay. He climbed into Miles's lap and curled against his chest. Evie looked at them, man and boy, not bound by blood, but by something deeper. Then she looked at the children sleeping under the sky, the wind rustling the trees above them like a lullaby. And she thought, This is the miracle. Not that we were rescued, but that we were rebuilt, thread by thread, choice by choice, breath by breath. Inside on the living room wall hung Eli's latest drawing, 7 figures, same faces, same hands joined. But now behind them stood not a house, but a quilt. Large, vibrant, each panel stitched with memories: a red bracelet, a banjo, a firewood stack, a single wooden box carved with us. Above it, written in careful block letters, "Our family isn't perfect, but it's ours." And for the first time ever and always, that was enough. And maybe that's what home truly is: not a place you find, but a space you choose again and again, through love, kindness, and the quiet bravery of staying. If this story touched your heart, we'd love to know, where in the world are you watching from? Drop a comment below. It means more than you know. And if you'd like to hear more stories like this, gentle, real, and full of hope, feel free to subscribe. This little corner of YouTube is always open for you. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for spending your time with us today. You being here, that's already a miracle.